Hello, this is Larry Berger. Delighted to be talking. I'm pretty used to the idea that my presentations are preceded by and often inspire hip hop dancing. And so I just want to thank the good folks from ASU GSB making me feel comfortable by putting me right after that. I, uh, I'm looking forward to talking about personalized learning. I will say that when I started work on this presentation back before COVID, I was excited to talk about some of the ideas and challenges about what happens with personalized learning in the classroom. And then we all know what happened. And I sort of looked back at these slides and it was kind of nostalgic in the sense that like, it would be great if these were the kinds of problems we were worrying about. And it seems like there are many more acute things that have presented themselves. But I am gonna try to deal with what has changed and maybe what's still the same, and also find our way back to some of those ideas about what the future of personalized learning might look like, whether we're in this remote learning period or, as many schools actually are right now, we are back to in-person learning. I thought I might start. I know we don't have exactly a question and answer capability here, but I thought I might start with, let me just share my slides here. With a pair of questions that I often think when we are in a situation where we can talk are a good way to get the conversation started about what do we really mean when we say personalized learning. So first question is just, what did a great teacher or coach do to personalize learning for you without needing a computer? And for today, could it have worked remotely? Could it have worked in a hybrid context where there was some remote and some in person? And then a second question, what's the best remote learning experience you've had? Ideally since March of this year, but if there was something you did way back when, in some other context of remote learning, share that too. I think there's going to be a way that they can pass your answers along to me, and we'll circle back and try to dig in on these. I'll say, since we can't exactly have a chat right now, that that very often the kinds of things people describe in answers to the first question are not, I was on my own personal journey being met at each level with just the right amount of challenge. Certainly no description of an algorithm. They often describe something that's social, that has a solitary component, that has a lot of productive struggle, a lot of suffering on the way to something that somebody really wanted to achieve. And so as we think about what personalized learning might be, that just in time, just enough challenge at exactly your level may not actually be the model that great learning tends to follow. And similarly, when people talk about the best remote learning experience that they've had, they very often move to some way in which people used the strangeness of remote learning to achieve a kind of asynchronous or synchronous social interaction that might have been hard to do in a real classroom with all the social pressures and the inability to be anonymous. And that something kind of magic happened because of the remoteness, not despite the remoteness. But maybe we'll get back around to that once people have some real examples. So I thought I might start, since the bulk of this presentation is some napkin sketches about where personalized learning often is and a kind of limited view of it, and where personalized learning could go if we had a more expansive and maybe more humanistically enlightened idea of it. But I thought I would start with some new slides that are just addressing this moment that we are in and how it changes the game for a lot of the dynamics of personalized learning. So a question that is often at the very start of any kind of personalized learning process is, we got to know, where are the kids in their progress towards mastery so we can personalize the learning to get them there. And I just want to call out, because it's such a burning issue in the country right now, that we have a harder question we have to answer before we can get to that first napkin, which is just, where are the kids? There's a heartbreaking article in ProPublica, I think it's also in the New Yorker this week, that is looking at lost kids, specifically a kid in Baltimore, and the experience of just the system not quite being able to hold on to them and them slipping away. And I think when I talk to my fellow ed tech CEOs, and we start sharing, so what's going on out there? Very often, a situation where 85% of the kids that you have enrolled in your system show up is considered pretty good. I'll confess that in my case, and I'm clean about it. And because it means that the system's kind of working for a whole lot of the kids. But 10, 15% of kids who are slipping through, who we don't know how to find, who the school system often doesn't know how to find, that's a crisis at the scale of hundreds of thousands of kids, if in fact most of the learning is now remote in this way, or much of it is. And so I just want to point out that there are some basic steps that we need to take as a system, as a country, before we can get to the elegant question of what's the best way to personalize instruction. We've got to find those kids, because the ones who are most at risk, most in need of this support, need that first step support, which is we have to personalize finding them, supporting them, enabling them to log on. And very often it's not a simple hardware or software fix. It's a whole social capital around that kid that just isn't there to get them logged in, even when they do have hardware or do have connectivity. And then there's mobility and trauma and people getting evicted. And let's just own that this problem has never been more acute, and that there are some people who are trying to use tech to solve this. I'm going to shamelessly plug, there's a little company called Kinvolved, Kinvolved, that has a really interesting platform for trying to use social connections among people in a community to help get kids to school and to help improve attendance over time. So let's notice that problem. The other is that in all situations in learning, the question of like what's happening in pop culture and consumer media and the other things that have kids wired up, and I use YouTube and sugar, but we could put a lot of other things in there that are the addictions, the adrenaline rushes, the highs that kids can access. And the problem used to be, how do you get kids to curl up and read a book, do their homework, when YouTube is hyperstimulating and there's 100 other things kids could get themselves drawn into? I think this problem has replicated itself. It's just that literally now there isn't that haven of school where kids might get a good meal and might have a little bit of time where everyone is focused on learning, and you can't get to the apps and you can't get to the games. That is getting harder and harder to achieve. And if schools think they've filtered and blocked, I think they are underestimating the different things that kids are doing. So let's also just own that once you move learning home and you don't have the controls of schools, you're competing against a set of distractions that are awesome in their ability to frack human attention as a kind of natural resource that is hugely profitable if you can extract it. And our tech companies and our food companies are getting so good at hooking kids that education doesn't have an easy fight. I think the way we win is some asymmetricness, but we'll get to that. Meaning we don't try to be more stimulating, or we rarely try to be more stimulating than those consumer media products, but we try to say there's something else about the social, intellectual, personal development part of school that actually those things can't compete with in terms of your own aspirations and how to fulfill it. We like to talk about how the idea of personalized learning is that it takes the system as we know it now and accelerates the ways in which students can learn by targeting just what they need in just the right ways. Right now, things are so broken operationally in schools. Again, there's heroic work being done by so many teachers, and there are places where things are going well, but there's almost nowhere where the problem of, I actually don't know how to get my kid logged in, and I don't have all the passwords, and it sounds like we're supposed to be in a Zoom that I don't have the code for. Those things are pervasive. This is a little bit of parent chat from a chat that a colleague was in this morning. And I should say these parents are all people with advanced degrees, and there are often two parents trying to get one kid on, and they are just, they're starving. And so, schools didn't have to use sending out calendar invites, sending out Zoom invites, sending out to-do lists as the main engine of how they got their work done. They got the kids in the building, they had their own rules for how they run. Now suddenly they're having to use a set of tools. Often it's the Google Suite or it's Zoom or some sort of calendaring program that weren't necessarily designed for them, and they just don't have experience using them. And so, very often parents are complaining that they're getting 10 invites to the same thing and no invites to the other thing their kids need to get into. And so let's just, really acknowledge that even as we like the idea of personalized learning, those of us who are working closely with schools, helping them with the basics of how to get kids, once you find them, logged in and productive and able to get to the stuff they need, is not something we can just assume away. Here's a structural thing about our industry, and now we're starting to get into the business of it. I think I would have asserted, and by no means there are people who would make a strenuous case on the other side, that the horizontal platforms, by which I mean the learning management systems, things like Canvas and Schoology, that they are unlikely to be the place where the heart of personalized learning unfolds, because they have to be designed for a generic experience so that all kinds of learning experiences can flow through them. They can't get deeply into the specifics of a certain kind of learning, a simulation environment for science, or a writing and feedback and collaboration environment for a humanities course. And they often don't have a very fluid way of using student data with any kind of model of what it is that kids are supposed to be learning and doing that day in that particular class, so that they can do granular kinds of personalization. So I used to think, like, those guys are out there, they are playing a useful role, we need a place to put our courses, but the personalization is going to live somewhere else, or those platforms are going to have to step up to a whole nother level of complexity. I now think that these platforms are winning because they're slightly less chaotic than the other things that are out there. And it gives you a place to log in. You can't expect that teachers are going to keep their 10 different passwords to each of the different places where kids have to learn. And so suddenly these horizontal platforms, I think, have a value and an importance that they should be commended for trying to help. I still think the problem exists, and I wonder if there might be a backlash where, once teachers get used to the idea that in order to teach digitally, I want a much higher level of integration. I want my assessment and my curriculum and my parent communication tools and my personalization engine and my supplementals and my core to all be flying in formation. And nobody does that very well yet. But I do think there are some bespoke players making particular curricula or particular intervention products that have more of those pieces lined up. And it's going to be an interesting race. But right now, I think those horizontal platforms are super important. And of course, when I say that, I definitely want to include, as probably the most important of them, Google Classroom and the Google ecosystem. And all of us need to play nicely with them and figure out how to support those platforms in being successful, even as the long run may be to transcend them with something that's a little bit more bespoke in how it supports the inside of teaching and learning. I'm going to jump into a discussion of personalized learning, and some of this is as it was written a long time ago, before all of this happened, and some of it is changed, or at least adjusted, or to speak to now. I wanted to go back to why we think personalized learning might have a value, an ability to succeed in reaching different kinds of education outcomes. And one of the strongest arguments is the argument from the research on tutoring. Kids getting one-on-one attention in a tutoring context have outsized gains that are much less susceptible to variations in the quality of the tutor than, say, teaching in a classroom. And so that idea that in lots of settings, tutoring is robust raises the question, is the thing about tutoring that's robust that the tutor knows where the kid knows the tutor's paying attention, and could we try to replicate that with software? So this idea, tutoring's in our head, maybe software could do something kind of like tutoring. The other thing that I think is lurking behind it is for those who are privileged enough to have the bedtime story be part of their existence, that idea of the adult who's creating a learning experience in which you get to drive some of the time because there's some back and forth about the story, but there's a story that carries the experience forward, and it's human and it's positive and it's intimate. Couldn't education have more of that? Shouldn't we use technology to free teachers up to do something that is a little bit more personal and human connection? So with those two kind of experiences lurking in the background, we say to ourselves, let's try to design a situation in which our schools could have, over here on one side of the screen, more personalized learning going on. But of course, as soon as we try to do that, what about the other kids? And it isn't long at any age of kids that before your personalized learning classroom breaks down because there are just too many kids and one teacher, and the lovely sketch of how it might work starts to fall apart. And putting it on Zoom only makes it worse because we've got, in some cases, the kids who are in the classroom, the kids who are remote, all of them having different kinds of problems and one teacher. So along comes engineering, comes software, and the proposal is, well, maybe I can help solve this. So the engineering mindset goes right to work and comes up with a theory of personalization that builds upon the fact that a computer can actually manage lots of different simultaneous multitasking routines. So a computer could take a bunch of kids at different levels, could take as many of them as you want, and come up with a path for those kids that might take them to do different activities at different levels of complexity. And in theory, if the computer can do that, it can help kids on longer journeys, and it can even manage potentially more educationally complex routines where the computer is directing a group of kids to work collaboratively in social and other ways, sometimes individually, sometimes in groups, sometimes. So not just like kid on a screen. And that seems like a beautiful way to envision education. Let's let the computer run that process. Here's the problem that I think we run into pretty quickly. In order to do that, you need to have a map of what are the things that kids need to know. And I'm zooming in on one early version of this map. This is Diderot when he was making the original encyclopedia. He created this map of all the different things that humans need to know and how they're connected to each other, and he put them on a tree. And in a certain way, everyone who's making educational technology builds a version of this. Sometimes it's just the steps in early reading or the steps in learning to do fractions, but there's some map of what kids need to know. And there's also some sort of assessment where we figure out where are kids, let's identify where they are, let's place them on the map somewhere where the stuff they already know is behind them and the stuff they need to know is ahead of them. And let's teach them something. In order to do that, we can go into a vast digital library of all the great resources that are out there, or into the database of a particular program, and there will be something for every kid with every learning style. We'll grab one of those things, let's take the microscope, we'll bring it to the kid, they'll do this lesson that involves the microscope, and at the end of that lesson, we'll assess them, and if they mastered it, they get to move forward on that, and if they failed to master it, then we'll try something else again, or maybe even consider that we need to move them back. And so hopefully they go forward, maybe they go back. Here's the problem. That map doesn't really exist. We have it for some small parts of education. We know it pretty well for the foundational skills of reading. We know it for number and operation in math, at least the more basic parts of number and operation. But it starts to get really cloudy and hazy. We don't actually know how to put the pieces together when you start entering advanced reasoning in the humanities, when you start doing advanced problem solving in science and math. We just don't know, do you need to know genes and then proteins and the traits, or traits and then proteins and genes? There isn't a map. And so sometimes we're imagining that we have a theory of how the software is moving kids along, and we really don't. We just have, you didn't get this lesson right, try it again. We actually don't have the measurement to make this work. When you try to figure out where a kid is on the map, the science of psychometrics would say you're gonna have to spend as much time measuring that kid to place them properly, or you're gonna have to spend so much time doing that that you might not have a lot of time for instruction if you want to do it with precision. So we don't actually have the map, we don't have the measurement that places us on the map. And I would argue that in most cases, we don't even have this wonderful library of the learning resources. We got some things, but we don't have all things. And many of the things we have are in books where it doesn't actually make sense if you haven't read the chapter before. And actually having kids jump around from one thing that you picked off Pinterest to the thing that you picked off of Teachers Pay Teachers, and they each explain negative numbers in a different way, it ends up confusing kids instead of being a coherent basis for them moving forward. So it's a system in which if you had a test, you had a map, you had a library of great resources, it would all work. We don't actually have those. And so very often we get ourselves in a world where we think the system could be working, but in fact, the pieces don't exist. And then even if they did, they create certain problems. One of them is, if different kids can pursue learning at their own pace, you, as a teacher, you run into, my kids are getting further and further apart. Some kids are really taking that license and running with it. A lot of kids are sort of struggling with it. And some kids are just rejecting the whole idea. That's our little kid at the bottom who just says, wait, I just because the algorithm and the map and the test says I need to learn this, doesn't mean that I personally am motivated to do so. And so, so those are the kinds of things that that can sometimes sort of hold us back in making this all work. And so, when we look at this model, it's the computer that's doing the personalization. It's the tasks of learning that are being personalized, and the class is set up as lots of individuals. There are other ways of thinking about this, and that's part of why I suggested that maybe a place to start is to ask yourself, what are the great learning experiences that you've had? And again, this stuff, the engineering model works kind of well for early reading and early math. But now it's time to ask, not just what was my first solution for how this might work, but how do I actually, as an engineer, as an inventor, talk to teachers and get them to say, here's what I'm trying to do now. And I have found that when you build on those, when you make it possible for teachers to do kinds of personalization that they've always done, that our best learning experiences are part of, you're actually in a much more fruitful and creative place for building great learning experiences. I'm going to list out a few of these. I don't think we'll probably get to all of them, but I'll spend a little time just to give people a flavor of a few other sketches that aren't that algorithmic engineering solution, but are alternatives that, because they come from how teachers do it, one thing teachers can't do is design a different learning path for all of the 30 kids they're responsible for. The things on this list, teachers actually do, and technology should actually meet them there and support them. And if it did, I think we'd have a lot more embrace of personalized learning. So the low floor, high ceilings model, this is the basic idea that you should be able to design tasks that are interesting enough that different kids who are at different levels, our green advanced kid, our yellow on track kid, and our red below basic kid, can each get to the end of that task. And our green kid might get there right away, and our red kid may not have gotten started, but this task is designed to invite kids in, to give them a starting point, a low floor, where we can all get into it. And then eventually a high, there's the task itself, and then a higher ceiling that a more advanced kid can continue to productively struggle with. So the idea here is a really well-designed task enables the class to stay together, doing something in which the personalization stays within the realm of that task. And this green kid may take several different approaches. In some of the best lessons from Japanese lesson study, there are a simple path to solving the problem. And then there are situations where you keep taking the tools away from kids that they used to solve the last one and say, now solve it. And you just keep pushing them on kind of what's possible. And interestingly, in the Japanese context where this sort of learning is celebrated, it's often the kid who struggled the most, who took the longest time to get there, who actually gets the non-ironic praise from their peers because they worked the hardest to get to the answer. It was easy for the kid for whom it was easy. And so that kind of encouragement would probably be elusive in a US classroom, but it would be great to try to achieve it. And it's symbolic of the fact that humans like the idea that we're all struggling in a common struggle, and all of us are going to get there. Another good example and I just should say, in remote learning, the version of this that I would love to see more of is I think teachers feel like they've got to fill the time talking over Zoom and keeping kids busy, and then they jump off of Zoom, now work on the problems. And I would just urge teachers to spend a lot more time starting up the Zoom, putting a low floor, high ceiling problem in front of kids, and then being quiet, letting them work, letting them make some progress. If you have a tool where you can check in on their work, encourage, push, share one of the ideas that one of the kids is coming up with. That idea of just give kids room to try and make sure the task is one where kids who finish early, you can give them that next level of challenge within that same task. So here it's the teacher who's doing the personalization. The teacher says, great, you mastered it. Here's a harder version of that problem. It's the path, the difficulty level, and the whole class is working together as a unit. Another example of one of those, I like to call it the yoga model, because in yoga, everyone is doing the same poses that have been, in theory, handed down from long ago. And yet what the teacher is focused on is not inventing those poses, because that's going to be consistent for the class and they've been handed down. It's the feedback. They're watching closely. How are kids learning? How are the students learning? Different people need different feedback. Advanced yoga people are working on subtleties of their breathing. I'm just trying not to fall down. And the teacher is designing feedback, not the task, not the level, that is just right for each learner. And same thing, I think, applies in this world of Zoom. We could work on shorter sessions of instruction. So less of the, I'm gonna try to explain the whole thing to you, but more set the task and then jump into high levels of activity, maybe 3 times the level of feedback. And just challenge yourself. If kids are writing, can I triple the number of comments that I write? If they're solving problems, can I triple the amount of encouragement that I give them as we go? And if that means logging in and watching their work evolve in real time inside Google Docs, I think that's a really great way to do remote learning. And just think, it's the feedback, it's the notion that someone is paying attention and trying to help me get there, that I think goes a really long way, especially now where kids feel quite disconnected from the learning. And another person on a screen talking at them is probably not where the action is for them. So I don't have to take you through this for each of these. Self-determination is just that idea that you can design a world where instead of saying, hey class, here's what we're all gonna do, you say, here's a set of things, choose the one that seems right to you, choose it at the level of difficulty that you feel prepared for. And interestingly, kids will often choose things that are more challenging than the teacher expects them to. And the fact that they chose it, the research shows, goes a long way to getting them to actually decide to succeed in it. And so that notion that you're setting kids on their own path, it's like the algorithmic engineering model that I talked about, but the big difference is the kids are opting in, they're selecting, and hopefully the teacher is saying, oh, whoa, no, that one might be a little too hard for you, but here's one that's still super challenging, or that one's a little bit too easy, I'm gonna push you. So they're helping, but it's still the kids who are opting in, and it's just the teacher coaching. And the schools that work this way are pretty strict about, teacher, you can coach, but if the kid decides to take the one that's too easy or too hard, you know, that's their prerogative. That's what it means to self-determine. And in the world of online learning, I know it's hard enough to get a few things into Google Classroom and ready to go, But as we get better at this, or if you figure out how to collaborate with your peer teachers or find good resources that are out there, the power of saying, hey, I've put a few different activities into our Google Classroom stream or into the LMS. Just do one of them. Just pick which text, just pick which activity or which experiment. That moment of self-determination, if it's a real choice, goes an awfully long way. Scaffolding, this one might be one of the most important and one of the places where technology can really play. That's just the idea that instead of saying, if you're a low reader, we're going to take you to the really basic text, and if you're a high reader, you get to read the sophisticated text. That has, the pretty serious problem that people who are advanced are getting more and more knowledge, getting more and more ahead. Kids who are behind are further and further from grade level, aren't building their background knowledge. What if we could get the scaffolds for each person to get them ready to do grade level text? And I love Phil Darrow's quote on this. Phil's one of the people involved in the math standards. And Phil says, you might be 4 years behind in math from your test scores, but you're probably only 10 or 15 minutes behind this lesson that we're going to do today. And if I could just get you that scaffolding, that support, that pre-teaching of the 10 or 15 minutes, I could actually enable you to participate. And with that, the motivation and a sense of social connection that would make you want to learn the rest of the math to participate all of the time. And this is the idea that different levels of scaffold for different kids. And again, it's the teacher who's doing it, it's different kinds of supports that are being personalized, and it enables the whole class to participate. And that, the power of that, and placing the personalization burden not on sending kids on separate journeys, but on a common journey, again, is a place where technology can really play. I will share that this is, just to make it clear, this is doable. This is inside Amplify. In our ELA curriculum, we have different levels of support for kids, all the way from moderate up to substantial, and also additional challenge for kids. And teachers can put kids in the groups. And then when an assignment or a task comes up, there's the core level, the grade level version of it. And then there's with moderate support or with additional challenge. And nobody sees that different kids are getting different scaffold except the teacher. And yet it means, because the kid on the right got some sentence starters that might help them succeed, that the teacher can more often bring all the kids into the conversation because they've each succeeded at a slightly scaffolded version of the task at a level that's appropriate for them. And then I'll just say storytelling in general becomes a really powerful tool. If you give people roles and they get to act things out and they get to each play parts of it, that goes a really long way towards creating a feeling of personalization. And I think especially in this period of remote learning, anytime a narrative can create some coherence, some holding it all together is really valuable. So I powered through this. As you can see, it's like different parts of this that are being personalized. Sometimes it's the nature of the choice, the difficulty of the task, the feedback, the time that's allowed. And I just challenge everyone to have the broadest possible view of what we mean when we say personalization, and that especially now, experimenting with these more natural kinds of personalization rather than just the algorithmic kind, I think might go a very long way. I've talked through a bunch of them today. I think there are more that are out there. I put a question mark there just because I love the idea of challenging folks to come up with a few more of their own ideas. And please, if you've got ideas, send them my way. I'd love to kick them around with you. And with that, I will pause, and I think we have a few minutes to do questions. If there are some. I don't quite know how questions get to me, but let's see. Here's the chat. Okay. All right. Oh yeah. Okay. Yes. So one of the people in watching this said that that the particular form of remote learning that has worked for them is one where there's just a lot more time on informal conversations, building relationships, giving people room to learn from each other, rather than that sense that there's something I've got to impart to you, and then I've got to give you the assignment, and then I've got to check in on the assignment. Learning involves a lot of that, but it should also just make some room for informal and relationship. And it's hard. I think with young kids, you often see when you create that flexible time, they just check out. They head to the fridge. They say, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. But I think over time, it might be better to let them check out a little bit, but let them know that there's going to be room. And pretty soon they start talking to the kid on the other side. And before you know it, small groups inside inside Zoom or whatever are forming. And I, very often, I like that comment. Very often when I have seen, when I participated in Great Learning, it's also in a remote context, lots of use of breakout rooms. I'm going to talk about something, breaking into groups. I'm going to let the groups talk more than I might normally let them talk, because there's some relationship building that we have to do. Yes, and the teacher's role in that, this is another comment coming in, is often to connect the learning to things that might matter in the student's personal life. So when the teacher pops into the small group conversation, you could be the didactic teacher who corrects what the kids are getting wrong, but you could try to intensify the human connections, try to encourage kids to collaborate and work well together in ways that might otherwise have been elusive. And I think when teachers do that, they create a spirit of, these online spaces aren't just lecture activity, but they're where you're getting the human connection that is so painfully missing from the lives of so many kids right now. Even the ones who have all the support that they need at home, their peers aren't in their lives in the ways that used to be motivating. And they don't always admit that that is getting them down, but very often, actually, right now they are admitting, and they're saying, hey, it's hard to learn without that energy that comes from my friends being in the class. Any other questions, comments, favorite learning experiences that people have had in a remote learning environment that you want to share, or just thoughts about these different models and what it means? I will, I'll give a moment for people. You can post it just using, I believe, the chat function in your seminar, and then folks will figure out how to move that over into Zoom to get it to me. I will say, I jumped right over, the engineering model and said, hey, this is good, it's valuable, we can do it well in some cases, but in other cases, it might not be the right model for what we are trying to do. I do want to point out that in this time of personalized learning, of remote learning, finding a high quality digital supplemental program, the kind that make the case for doing remote learning. So, personalized learning. So these would be the Dreamboxes, the Lexias, the iReadies, the Amplify Reading is our own version of this, and a fraction one. All of those are engines that do that kind of figure out where kids are, advance them if they're making progress, give them more and more challenge, and let them get to mastery of the skill, and then move on to the next skill. And you can choose which one you like the best. Make sure to check out our own Amplify Reading. But I just think right now these are so important, because it is hard to make the whole system work all day long. And so something goes down with Zoom, something goes wrong with the lesson that you planned, something's inaccessible about Google Classroom. And that idea that you can say, hey, for 15 minutes, I need you guys to get on that digital supplemental, get on Dreambox and practice your math, or learn some new math. I just think is such an important pressure relief for teachers, especially because so often teachers are also parents with all the problems that their kids are having, and they just need the ability to say, okay, class, 15 minutes of that program. So I like those programs for their learning power, but I also really like them for their babysitting power. And I think we should just own that teachers need that kind of help. Can't overdo it. If you tell kids to do an hour and a half of that stuff a day, they're going to get really bored of it and really angry pretty fast. But if you do just the right amount, then it works. I'm seeing a few things. This is apparently, I think one of the things people are talking about is just that question of like, how do you facilitate the ability for kids to connect with each other? And I'm not sure it matters what they connect about. When you think about office water cooler talk back when everyone used to go to offices, a lot of it is about sports, it's about the weather, it's about something in people's weekend, but it's that set of connections that make you feel familiar with others and become the foundation for doing ambitious kinds of work. And I just think everyone's eager to get kids caught up, to get them back on track. Our data is certainly showing that the predicted learning loss is real. Maybe too soon to say the scale of it, but there's going to be a lot of catching up to do. But I still think a foundation of some kind of connectedness to the teacher, to the other kids, is really worth investing time into. And academically, that part that is feedback is really key. So someone is also saying, those scaffolds, the high, medium, low support for teachers, really, really hard. I agree. I do think it's up to curriculum developers to do the kind of work that we're trying to do at Amplify, to build those scaffolds so that teachers aren't having to build it themselves. And teachers can focus on giving feedback, making the lesson come to life, but the supports are built in through software. And again, that's where engineers could do something different than just build algorithms and computer-driven experiences. They could help a social classroom come to life. And with that, I think we are at the end of our time. And it's been a delight to talk with you about this, but it would be a lot more fun to have back and forth. So please do be in touch.